This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back here in the venue and online. Here in the venue, I hope you enjoyed the coffee and the pastries. Sorry that we were a bit late. We had some technical difficulties. Today, we talked already a lot about the digital transition. And if you're fed up by that by now, I have some good news, because the next 45 minutes, we're going to talk about that thing that the other side of Brussels talks about a lot. That's the green transition. But we're going to talk about how the green transition and the digital transition relate with one another. Green technology, as it is called. Because every time that you save a document in the cloud or when you watch a movie online, there is a lot of digital infrastructure needed to make that happen. Think about data centers, think about internet cables, and much more. And of course, that has a physical impact. We're going to talk about that with 4 esteemed speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. 2 will join us online and 2 will join us live. Let's start with the ones that are joining us live. First of all, we have Kim van Sparrentak, who's an EU lawmaker for the Greens. Welcome. Then we have Christina Cinemas, who is the Minister for Digital Strategy in the German region of Hessen. Welcome. And then online, I hope they're both connected by now, because those were the technical difficulties that we had. Online, we have first Minchi Chen, who's an assistant professor at the Princeton University, and Caroline Golin, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's the global head of energy market development at Google. Welcome as well. First of all, of course, again, a few housekeeping rules. You can ask questions on the Swapcard app, and you can also chat over there. I'm going to chat, of course, here as well. Let's dive right into it, because, yeah, the green technology and the fact that you have this green transition, the digital transition, happening at the same time. Kim, if I can say, Kim, if that's okay, yes, to please address you with the first name. You are one of the lawmakers really pushing the Commission to have a strategy on this, to make sure that when we speak about the green transition and the digital transition, that they don't get in each other's way. Can you elaborate a bit about why, according to you, that's really necessary to have?
Yeah, I think what I saw happening. So of course we have the Green Deal as one of the flagships, and then a Europe Fit for Digital Age as the other flagship. And what I really saw happening was that those two were never communicating with each other. We were talking about how to, make to have innovation in the tech sector, how to regulate the very large online platforms, and then we were talking about, how to reduce emissions. But if you increase a lot on one side and try to reduce on the other side, then at some point those two can hamper each other. I at some point started asking questions about where do these interlink, and I also realized that the different DGs in the Commission, for example, were not talking with each other that often, and I think it is very important that we take both into account. First of all, because there is a climate crisis around, and if we have a lot of new technologies, that they should actually help to combat the climate crisis and not add to it. So that was my main objective behind it. But it was mainly because I noticed that there was just no one was talking about it. Everyone was talking about it in silos. And both these transitions, we were talking about the twin transition, but they were not twinning. They were very separate, and both of them are very horizontal. It will impact, the whole society on both ways, on both sides. So I think it's very important that we also look at them together.
Because twinning, of course, is winning. Let's maybe turn to Caroline from Google. That must sound very familiar to you when we speak about indeed increasing the digital, for example, usage of cloud, etc. But at the other side, of course, also reducing the footprint. Can you maybe elaborate on how on top of mind is that at the side of Google?
Yeah, absolutely. And can everyone hear me? Am I okay?
Perfect.
Apologies for having to zoom in. It is something we think about at Google. I mean, there are a lot of factors that have gotten us to the place that we're in facing climate change. But one of the main factors is that we have a market failure, and we have a lack of information, and we have a lack of tools to solve the problems that we've created. And so with all of our tools across all of our products, across our digital infrastructure, we are focused on making sure that we are driving a more sustainable future, a more sustainable economy. So whether that's with our products, like Environmental Insights Explorer, or the work that we're doing right now with Maps, or work we're doing right now with Search, but also with our digital infrastructure, right? So I oversee a lot of the work of our data centers and how our data centers can be as sustainable as possible. And a major objective of ours is to be not only the most energy efficiency infrastructure on the grid, but also to be running our infrastructure on carbon-free energy. Globally, we've been able to match all of our energy use by 100% renewable energy since 2017. In 2020, we made the commitment to say, you know what, actually, that's actually not enough, right? If we really want to decarbonize the grid, we need to use our purchasing capital to invest in the technologies that are going to fully decarbonize our grid operations and all of our footprints. So that means we shifted to starting to procure renewable and clean energy locally and do that on an hourly basis. And that required an insane amount of data analytics to even figure out our carbon footprint. So going through that process for ourselves to say, we're committed to completely decarbonizing our footprint, led us to this moment where we said, this takes a lot of time. This takes a lot of analytics to even know the carbon footprint of your grid. This needs to be accessible to the greater public, because if you don't have the information, you can't measure it, you can't deploy the solutions to it. So with our cloud customers, we're working on that day in and day out, helping them to understand their carbon footprint so that they can take better steps to invest in the right technologies that the grid needs to see us really go to zero.
All right. Because I was a bit intrigued by your job title. Your job title is really about energy market development. So it's really about seeing what's on the market and to make that more sustainable. If I'm interpreting that correctly.
Yeah, correct. I would say this: there isn't an energy market in the world today that is built for decarbonization, right? So we have to go out and build those market structures. And that actually Europe is going through this right now, and we're going through this conversation right now. And so the majority of my job is working with other partners and stakeholders, regulators, policymakers, to figure out what are the market structures we need to put in place to drive decarbonization of the grid, and then what are the products that we need to create, energy products that we need to create, technologies we need to advance to make sure that that the markets are working to draw these new technologies in, and those technologies are deployed quick enough.
Well, luckily we have some policymakers here with whom we can have this conversation here. Because if I look, for example, at the region of Hessen in Germany, that's also Frankfurt, the big city, the big financial city, big financial hub, where a lot of transactions need to happen. So I can imagine that in that region, it's really also a knot of different digital infrastructure, and you have to think up or come up with a digital strategy for all of that to really make sure that works together. Also on the environmental side, how do you start something like that?
We are really happy in Hessen that we have had the chance to build up an own ministry for digitalization and strategy and development of digitalization. And as Kim mentioned, we want to go away from the silos and want to have an integrated and horizontal approach. And that's what we have done. So in building up the ministry, we tried to look at interfaces between the silos. And one interface we really have to face in the future is the interface of digitalization and sustainability. And from my point of view, the talking together, the dialogue, the stakeholder dialogue is really one focus we have to go for. And that's what we have done. We built up a data center office. As you have said, we are not of the data centers, and data centers per se are very energy consuming. But at the end of the day, they want to change in more sustainability. And how the different stakeholders can do this together, then we have to talk together. And we initiated a stakeholder dialogue, so to bring all the partners on a round table to discuss where are the problems, where are the hurdles. We initiate a data center office who can not only be a partner in a dialogue, who can be a partner in consulting the future of sustainability and data center. And we initiate some projects where we can, as pilot projects, try to find out where the future of digitalization and sustainability on the technical part can be maybe a kind of a roadmap for other regions.
Part of the dialogue is, of course, also the academics, and we have one here in the conversation as well. Because if we speak about doing more and doing more digitally, more cloud adoption, more internet usage, and doing that with less resources, I'm really happy to hear from our expert, Minji Chen. Yeah, if we speak about energy efficiency there, what's your take? How should that happen? Buzzing digital activity with less resources.
Sure. My name is Minji Chen. I'm a system professor of Princeton University. I work in the area of power electronics. We build circuit systems to support all kinds of electronic loads, including computers and telecommunication devices. So one of the things that I guess the public is not aware of is that we are working very hard to make computing more efficient. And that's why with the past decades, all of us is benefiting from the digitalization, but we don't really talk about energy issue. But unfortunately, moving forward, on one hand, we have the Moore's law getting close to the end, meaning that we're not being able to greatly advance the efficiency of electronics as we have been doing in the past. And as a result, it's very important to think about how do we scale the computing infrastructure. On the other hand, probably all of us heard about ChatGPT and artificial intelligence, and training all of these AI models, large-scale language models, consume a huge amount of energy, and we don't know how to solve the problem. And as a result, it's very important to look into new materials, new systems, new computer architecture, asking a question of how do we scale computing so that we can satisfy the demand of the future is critically important. And these require innovations from many aspects, including technologies, public policy, business models, how do we drive innovation forward and really benefit the society. And also sort of like public aware that when you are looking at the internet, playing with AI models, there's also an energy incentive behind it. The other critical issue that I want to mention is sustainable electronics. So we're talking about sustainable computing, growing data centers. And one fact that the public probably is not aware of is that every 3 to 5 years, the data centers are going to be upgraded. So they replace all the computers with the newer ones for energy efficiency reasons. As a result, we're producing a huge amount of electronic waste. And currently, as far as I know, there are not sustainable solutions for all of this electronic waste. And thinking about environmental impact or environmental footprints of all of these electronic computers is very important. And I hope that we can get more and more attention from public and from the policymakers.
Yeah, let's break that up maybe, because you said a lot of things. E-waste. Let's park that for a moment, because there was this remark about ChatGPT, a very energy. I mean, it uses a lot of energy to train those models, but also to use those models. You're also working on the AI Act. You're just coming from a big meeting on this AI Act. What's the sustainability side from AI and from language models like ChatGPT?
Well, I think it has two sides, and these are two sides that we as Greens put as priorities for the AI Act. One of them is indeed, if you look at the standards, also look at the environmental standards. Make sure that on the one hand, you have transparency on how much energy an AI system uses, just to make sure that, if you in the end take our small startup and you use one of those systems, you don't go bankrupt because your energy bills suddenly are very high. It's quite nice that you know at least how much energy you're going to use. But secondly, also to incentivize companies and people that are programming AI systems to do that in an energy efficient way. The second part, of course, is also looking at the impact that AI can have on the environment. So making sure that it actually benefits the climate and that we don't put AI systems in oil rigs without good scrutiny. That would also be something. I mean, we have to get rid of oil rigs, but as long as we use AI to make them safe, I hope that, that's good. That's good AI.
And how far can you go there? Because you can say like, okay, we need to have transparency about this. We can, but there is maybe some things that you can mandate, but not an awful lot, I think. Or how far can we go there?
Well, we want to have standards, so environmental standards, and preferably that they are international standards that all AI systems have to adhere to, and to make sure that everyone at least takes it into account. Because, as I said before, if we suddenly have AI everywhere, while we are really, really all trying to turn off our lights more often and take into account that we, don't use cars that often anymore. Meanwhile, we have these huge data centers just training. It's fun, ChatGPT, but so far it's mainly fun. Some people are already using it for work purposes, obviously. But yeah, that's I think one of the things that we really have to take into account to make sure that we reduce the energy use.
You're touching on an interesting point indeed. Like you have the public that is really, for example, we're now going back again into the summer. Temperatures will rise again. For example, last summer there was some problems with data centers who really, when it becomes very hot, you need a lot of water for cooling those systems. Minister, you said earlier that you are a region with a lot of data centers. Is that something that is really high on the agenda to make sure that they don't use up that much water, or to make sure that when you ask citizens to be economical with their water, that you don't have at the same time a data center taking up all that water?
It is high on the agenda, and let me point it out on two examples. It's high on the agenda because we pay special attention on the topic of green IT. And we do it on one hand, if we have a program where young startup companies get money from us, if they really have a system, maybe using AI, for optimizing climate strategies or calculating climate strategies of companies. So we have a young founder team in the north of Hessen who gets money from us, and they have developed an automated and intelligent platform who can calculate in forehand how the climate strategy of the companies will fulfill in future and be more sustainable. That is on one hand, to invest in founders and companies who can adapt in green IT. On the other hand, we have the data centers, and the data centers, even in Hessen, try to be more sustainable in the future, and we invest in pilot programs where they can use the heat, for instance, for the heat for having house warmings from new buildings. And this is another pilot in the focus of green IT in Hessen, and that's the two...
But that's the carrot, because you're incentivizing the companies to do better. Is there also maybe, should there be a stick to say, like, if the data center by, 2025 still uses that much water or that much energy, should there be a stick to...
Yes,
hold
but
them accountable?
that is something what we want to have as an integrated pilot modeling as one of the essential coming outs of the stakeholder dialogue. They have to sit together and try to find out how we can really have this future options, and maybe we give funding in such projects. One of the projects is already running. It's called Westville in Frankfurt in this region. Other projects we want to set up for the future.
Yeah. Let's maybe turn to Caroline from Google. Of course, Google, a lot of data centers, for example, also in the Netherlands. What is your approach on water? Because it will be a major issue the next coming years. How is Google trying to bring down the use of water?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to that. I just want to give one other point on AI, because I think it's important to recognize how much AI is going to be critical for scaling renewable energy and for creating the grid infrastructure that we need to actually decarbonize the grid. So, you know, we've worked with ENGIE to accelerate wind energy development, and we've used artificial intelligence, which allows them to advance their data management so they have a better forecast of wind patterns. They have a better way to time on the grid, and they can actually deliver more wind capacity. If you scale that across the grid, at the end of the day, our grid is clunky. Our grid isn't as smart as it needs to be, and we're leaving a lot of money and we're leaving a lot of electrons on the table. So using AI to actually make the grid smarter and quicker is going to reduce overall energy use and energy burden across the system, because it helps you to make those quicker, just-in-time and deliverable decisions that allow that 30, sometimes 40% of energy waste that's often on most grids to sort of, you know, effectively disappear. On water, the other thing that I want to say is that, and I think I might have froze, sorry about that. Water and energy are two sides of the same coin. You know, I'm sure many people have heard of the water energy nexus. It's actually what I did my PhD work in, so I actually like to talk about this. But water and energy are two sides of the same coin. So if you decrease water use and use something like air cooling within a system, you are going to increase energy use. So you really have to take these into account together. And you need to actually look at it as like, what is the biggest carbon intensity of our resource use? So if we are able to air cool our systems and do that in a way that we're able to meet that energy need with decarbonized energy, that's net benefit to the overall system. If we're in a situation where we're not water stressed, where there's enough replenishment in the system and we're not going to create undue burden on the energy side, then we tend to use water cooling to cool our system.
But do you mean then that there should be like, is it like choosing between the lesser of two evils, or what's?
Well, it's actually about bringing intelligence and awareness around the fact that these aren't two evils. These are interconnected, right? And we need to really look at the carbon intensity of of resource uses and look at it as a whole envelope. And if we don't do it that way, to the earlier point, if you can have policy on this side and policy on that side, and if they're not talking to each other, you can end up in a difficult situation. And we take that same approach at Google, which is that really trying to understand what is the whole impact, and also that we have a responsibility to those watersheds. So we've initiated multiple programs globally where we take responsibility in those watersheds and making sure that we are being as most sustainable as we can be with the extraction and the input back into those watersheds. And we never are going to take water where a watershed is already stressed and where our footprint could become problematic. But if you think about it, if we go into an area and we say our footprint is going to deploy clean energy, and that clean energy brings that coal offline, that's actually improving the watershed, right? Because then the water that's being used for the coal plant is no longer being used. And so it's really about understanding that full nexus together and thinking about it.
So bringing it together. Let's maybe turn to the professor for a moment, because I hear a lot about scaling and really bringing that to a more global level and talking to each other and making sure that the different systems are really interconnected and talking to each other. But I also hear that it's difficult to do that because, of course, the grid is already very, maybe even overburdened at times. What is, according to you, what needs to happen to make sure that idea of indeed talking to each other and the different systems, bringing them together, what should happen there?
Yeah, I echo that that there's great synergy between computing and renewable energy and water systems because, for example, one critical issue of bringing renewable energy to the electric grid is the intermittency. And data center is actually a perfect demand response infrastructure that can help to incorporate more renewable energy to the grid, but we have to do it in the right way. And with the traditional way of controlling the grid, like with all the equations and models, is actually not able to respond fast enough and smart enough. And that's where AI models can come in, telling us how do we combine renewable energy and demand response and the capability of the electric grid. And I would say that this is a really exciting research opportunity, and a lot of research communities are looking into this. But I would say that international collaboration is super important. Like in the United States, probably we are okay because it's a big country where it's relatively easier to get like a supply and demand balance for electricity. But I guess in Europe, there are more international collaborations has to happen to enable, because the supply and demand doesn't happen at the same geographical location.
And
so,
isn't it great that we then have the European Union, who maybe can foster that international collaboration?
I'm not a political expert, so I don't know. So I would imagine sort of like there could be some burdens that like how do we? They're not geographically located at the same place. So how do we make it happen? How do we incentive policy and economical tools to make it happen? So this could be a great synergy over there. Regarding water, Caroline also mentioned like for cooling, but I would also emphasize that there are a lot of water demands in the manufacturing process of the semiconductors for the microprocessor. So in terms of water usage, we should look at the entire life cycle. So there are many places where there are interconnection between renewable energy and grid and communication and water systems. So and there are just a lot of unexplored opportunities there.
Kim, I've heard a lot of things that can come, of course, on the table of Europe, because indeed you hear like, okay, we have maybe some water-stressed regions where Google can maybe try to use more the energy instead of water to do the cooling, but then you have maybe in another country another problem. So there is really a big puzzle that needs to be laid at the European level, I think then.
Yeah, and I think actually what the professor just said, I think looking at the whole supply chain is key. We cannot just only look at one aspect of the whole supply chain, and we already have to look at the critical raw materials at the start, but then also look indeed at how much data is being used, what kind of data centers there are, how much water is being used, also indeed in the production, and I think. One of the main issues we have is that there's still not a lot of clarity. There's still a lot of big tech companies who say they are carbon neutral, where I'm always wondering how that's possible. And there's still and there's not that much transparency either. So I think, and of course it's very easy to say, oh yeah, we bought another forest and now we're carbon neutral. But actually the amount of energy that's being used with all this computer data, that we have no idea. And secondly, what I think is very important, that we also start looking a bit of like what is necessary. In every aspect of our society, we're now looking at where we can reduce the amount of energy that is being used. And I think especially when we're talking about things that we are doing digitally, there's a lot of things that we don't need to do, but we're doing them because some companies like them. And I commissioned a study, for example, on how much energy we could reduce if we stop targeted ads in Europe on mobile phones, and it would be the amount of energy of the city of Barcelona, of Lisbon. But I think it's a bit smaller, but it's Lisbon. But still, I mean, these are things I think we should look at the whole supply chain, and in the end, we also have.
Can I cut you off? Because I wanted to come back on the priorities of tasks and things that we need to do with the energy later. So I'm going to park that. But first, maybe Caroline, because you were kind of called out. I hear you're not transparent, or Google is not transparent. I hear from. So
Oh, well, I agree with the statement. We need more transparency. I think that maybe the audience knows, maybe the audience doesn't know, but most corporates and most businesses in the world are driven by their sustainability claims are driven by something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And this is sort of, I like to call it the shadow institution that says, if you do X, Y, and Z, you can claim X, Y, and Z. And it was an initial tool, I think, to try to drive corporates to invest in caring about their footprint. I think where we've gotten to a place, and I think this is Google's journey in particular, is that we recognize that our footprint matters to the communities and to the economies where we occupy space, and that we have a responsibility for our footprint to be as clean as possible. And the grid, anywhere you go, is 50 to 70% of emissions across any supply chain. It's the grid. You decarbonize the grid and you're over halfway there to this problem. And what I would love to see is more corporates, more buyers working with policymakers to figure out the ways to deploy private capital to decarbonize the grid, not to build a forest someplace else and then say that that's offsetting the use of coal someplace else. Saying, no, let's actually solve problems. And you need transparency to do that. You do need data to do that. But you also need the policies and the markets to do that. Google's been at this for 3.5 years now. And, we've signed over 7 gigawatts of renewable energy globally, many of which are, in Europe. But there still aren't the market mechanisms for corporates to really go out and procure those next generation technologies that are actually going to fully decarbonize the grid. Because if we don't do that, we can't get there. Yeah.
Earlier you talked about indeed like developing that markets and
Yes.
making sure that there is that something that you can.
That is something I can definitely take up, and that is what we are doing as well. For instance, you need, at the end of the day, you need the infrastructure to calculate the AI models, for instance. So you have to invest in the infrastructure. But at the end of the day, the infrastructure has to be housing somewhere. And that is something we discussed, for instance, where can we buy the hardware, but where can we put the hardware? And we put the hardware, for instance, in a water-cooled green IT cube. So there you combine, on one hand, the infrastructure, on the other hand, the sustainability, and then we open it for the usage of the companies and the usage of the research as well. And to build up this model was only possible in talking together with the Googles of the world, talking together with the SMEs, talking together with the data center, and then said, how can we hit our future challenges in the best way? On one hand, using infrastructure, buying infrastructure, on the other hand, being sustainable. So combining digitalization and infrastructure in a best way of saving climate.
Mm-hmm. There is another item I still wanted to go into, because end of last year, the EU Commission published an action plan on the digitizing the energy grid. But one of the items was also the energy consumption of consumer devices, ICT devices, and data centers. Kim, you asked for that to happen. Is that what's currently on the table here in Brussels? Because that's why we are, of course. Is that enough, or does more need to happen there?
Well, I think it's a start, but I'm not sure if it's enough yet. I think, as I said before, like we are now indeed looking at some aspects, but and I think consumer devices definitely have a huge environmental impact, also because of the way our society works, and of the way that oh, you have a phone. I have a phone that's 3 years old, and people are like, how can you live? Like, don't you need a new phone every year? So besides, having legislation, we also need a mentality shift and see how we can, have devices that are easily repairable with the right to repair, but also to make sure that we have more conscious about the impact that is actually there when it comes to consumer products. And I think, it's a whole transformation that we have to get to. And what's on the table now are very good first steps, but I don't think that is the end of the whole transition.
Yes, I think exactly this mind shift is something which is very necessary.
Yeah.
And the mind shift means thinking more in supply chains than in silos. And that means to really build up digital education, digital competencies, and dialogue. I think this is very important. And we learn a lot in having this dialogue with the stakeholders. For instance, the stakeholders who are consumption energy in data centering and are using this at the end of the day, like research and SMEs. And I think this is something where we had really on the future, where we really have to push a lot, even from the European level, but from the regional level as well, to have more in the mind of the people that digitalization means using the energy of the future and using a supply chain.
But apart from EU plans, there is also a plan in Germany in the making on the federal level. Isn't it weird that you have, like, on these different levels, different plans? Shouldn't this be more coordinated?
It should be more coordinated. It should be more organized. But and for this, my wish for the future would be, I'm happy that we have the chance to build up a horizontal ministry coordinating all the digital activities in my region. If we would have this in every region, if we would have this in every European country, we could be much more efficient than having so puzzled structures that we have at the end at this moment.
Maybe Caroline from Google, how do you see that? Because you, of course, as a global player, has to speak with different regulators in different countries and different players in the system. How would you like to see this going forward?
Well, so I think if you can get a good working model in any country that brings together the right stakeholders and makes blueprints that are actionable, I think that's a wonderful way to scale policy. I tend to be, policy by project can take a long time, but if you get the right, stakeholders on board quickly, I think you can scale something like that. What I would caution though is that when as a global company, you want to be able to replicate things, right? And so whenever we're thinking about integrating different frameworks, you need to think about it across, how is this going to work across Europe? And then how would that work also in Asia, which is where a lot of supply chain comes from? And how does that work in the United States? So I'm always a big fan of saying, let's try to get a working model going. And we always support that. We have, people in country who are working at the ground level, local, state, country, state, at the EU level. But you always have to think about how this is going to work across Europe, because what gets very, very hard as a business having one regulation in one country, another regulation in another country, another regulation, it actually inhibits us from being more innovative on driving solutions.
Yeah, okay.
Because if we can see across the footprint, it's easier for us to develop new solutions and scale those in a way that are replicable. And Google really sees ourselves not on the tip of the spear for data centers, but the tip of the spear for all industrial players. So I'm interested in what lessons can we learn on making the digital infrastructure as clean and sustainable as possible, and then transferring those to other industrial players.
Yeah, replicable. I'm going to cut you short here because
exactly.
I really wanted to squeeze in one last question to the professor, because we talked earlier a bit about prioritization, and if you're short on energy and we may face another hard winter next winter, what should you prioritize? Not targeted ads, I've heard here from Kim, but what is your take on that? Really short, because we're almost running out of time.
So I'm not sure I understand your question. You're saying that if I can do one thing, what should we do? Is that what sort of what you're trying to say?
Yeah, it's about the prioritization of digital tasks when we're short on energy.
That's a hard to take.
That's a hard one. Okay.
Yeah, I guess it is no just one solution, right? Because everything is important. Like you can't ask people to reduce your usage of internet or reduce the digitalization. That doesn't make sense. I guess we just have to. I think creating. I really echo with the transparency. Because right now, if you type in how much energy does ChatGPT use in ChatGPT, and you will say it's not public disclosed information. So I guess they are. It's very important for public awareness of computing, energy consumption of computing. This is number one task, I would say. And other than that, as I said, we sort of mentioned that electronic waste is a big problem, and I hope that there are more attention paid on this issue.
If it's possible, I'd love to give an example of how we can.
A really short example.
Energy
2 lines.
Well, okay. I'll just say is that, during the energy crisis, we did work internally for our compute tasks to deprioritize tasks and to shift them to other areas so we weren't being a burden on the system. That was a very, 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 very challenging venture internally, but we gladly took it on because we knew we needed to be a good grid citizen. That has spurred us into thinking about how do you create better demand response products, and working with TSOs to get there. So you can take initiative internally and then think about what are the right market signals, what are our products externally that are going to drive that.
And there was another suggestion here. It was deprioritization of targeted ads. It was maybe also a good one for Google. We really have to wrap up because we have to move on to the next panel. I really want to thank all the speakers. I think the main takeaway was that AI can be the problem, can be the solution, and we really want to know the energy usage of ChatGPT. That would be a very interesting one. Please stay seated because after this we have a really high-level interview done by our editor-at-large, Nick Vineker. He's going to speak with Nadia Calvino of Spain. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.